So, for those of you tuning in for the first time, I'm a big fan of horror games. I know, right? Big shocker. My Steam library is full of horror games, played a dozen of indie horror stuff from itch.io, own public combo things. I've even made videos in the past on Roblox horror games. Something that's always tough though, when trying to find good Roblox horrors, having to go digging through the heaps of trash to find that one gemstone. And I'm not really proud to admit it, but sometimes I've become so desperate that I simply Google Roblox horror games and I look through the countless articles of people being scared by blocks. One game is consistently placed in these articles, however, and it's a game created by Team Motherboard. It's identity fraud. Identity fraud begins very simplistic and basic. There's no lobby except for the first starting screen, and there's no loud booming music trying to set a tone either. It's just a plain white GUI when you click play. The introductory speech to identity fraud is one that's often overlooked by most people who play. You're in the presence of your doctor. Whether it's an average checkup or something came up, we can't quite say. What's important is how you act during the visit. Your doctor tries to speak with you, but it's very clear you're not interested in entertaining whatever they have to say. It's almost as if you're in this sunken state due to the uncomfortable nature of people watching you. You're only able to speak about how you don't think these sessions are helping. It's an attempt that is immediately silenced as your doctor speaks up and tries to reason with you about your sessions. However, before being able to continue, you start to lose oxygen. You can't breathe. People come rushing to your aid, trying to help you, but before the issue gets resolved, the GUI fades, with you believing that your own doctor might have poisoned you. As the GUI fades, you're met with the first hurdle. It's a large beige maze. The first maze is a major tone setter in identity fraud. It's quite clear how basic and primitive the building you're standing in is. Now, bear with me for a moment because this is going to be a bit of a stretch. FNAF.
87?
Okay, hear me out. Just listen. Just listen. Okay, FNAF, whether you'd like to admit it or not, is an extremely bare bones and basic game. It makes up for the simplicity in heaps of atmospheric cues and enemy interaction. Identity fraud has the same system. Identity fraud does an excellent job of keeping the player on edge with an incredibly eerie sound design. You don't directly hear monsters stomping around the map, rather you hear their audio cues. This technique gives the player the knowledge of the monster exists, but it never answers where does the monster exist at. Arguably having this knowledge is worse than not having it, especially when facing some of the monsters in identity fraud. Creativity pours from each one of the monsters, once again not entirely visually, but in terms of how they interact with the player in the massive maze you've had the displeasure of being placed within. The first monster most players meet is Stan. Stan has the most bland and basic appearance when compared to all the other monsters. Ironically, Stan is also probably the most recognizable in comparison to the cast of monsters. Completely black in complexion except for its beady red eyes that it has. Stan isn't directly threatening. It can kill you, but its intention is primarily to place stress upon you, not having a walking animation but rather teleporting around when you're not looking. Stan's most dangerous when used in conjunction with other monsters, the most notable being Fraud. Fraud is the primary monster of identity fraud. It's green, it's green.
It's me, bro.
Oh shit, it's fraud, it's fraud, it's fraud.
Bro. It's me, man.
Oh my god, it got me, jumped me. If you've seen this game before, typically it's a video of Fraud torturing someone within this maze.
Oh my god, she waved at me! She's coming! Ah! Ah! Stop! Hello? Hello, child.
He's originally full black and lacking the beady red eyes of Stan. It isn't until Fraud catches and then eventually latches onto a player that Fraud updates their appearance to look just like their victim. Interestingly, during the Fraud chase sequence, speedrunners have actually learned how to bait Fraud around the maze in order to get the chase's speed boost and move faster. And honestly, I would argue Fraud is one of, if not the most effective monster in a Roblox horror game. Identity Fraud's chat system is strange. Typically when you speak in a Roblox game, a white bubble appears above your head. This denotes to other players that you're speaking, as well as the chat box in the upper left corner of most screens. Why would I mention this? Well, there's no chat bubbles in Identity Fraud, just the chat box in the top left, which means that talking in an attempt to decipher whether or not you're seeing fraud is completely futile. This complete lack of power on the player's end weaves distrust that just can't be mimicked in other games. Speaking of mimicking, with the removal of texting, that leaves Fraud with nothing he can't copy. You've been robbed of one of the most basic human abilities, speech, just to be opposed by a creature that will use your handicap to its fullest and steal your identity. Ralph only adds to make this maze even worse. Ralph, thankfully, is much more of a rare enemy. Spawning in after a server's lifespan is roughly 45 minutes. Interestingly, he's slower than the player by a decent amount, that is, until he slowly ramps up his speed towards the player. Ralph begins slow, but quickly builds up speed and eventually moves faster than you. He also continuously trails you even though you turn corners. Ralph plays neatly into the aforementioned statement of eerie ambiance. The entirety of the game's ambiance will slowly shift before, during, and after. Ralph spawning, starting with a simple melody that slowly becomes dark and concludes with an ominous theme as Ralph stalks the corners of the maze with his machete in hand. Thankfully, there is a door deep in the corner of the first maze. Paired with a button, pushing said button gently opens the thick ironclad gate to a much greener hedge maze. Surprisingly, this maze is somehow even more bare than the first maze, trading the trimmed walls and cream-colored ceiling for dark green hedges that tower into the abyss that is the night sky. Barely lit along the way are these lanterns, as well as this tiny little firefly. Kate is the only monster that spawns and roams in the hedge maze. She's especially interesting purely because whilst every other monster is advertised clearly and prominently, Kate is left completely devoid of attention. It's likely due to the fact that her appearance is extremely deceiving. Kate floats as a firefly unless the player looks at her for too long, instead transforming into a woman with long claws that will attack you. It's also interesting how Kate's gained popularity under the name Alice instead of Kate. Personally, I don't understand why, and sources in the Identity Fraud wiki don't even explain why either. I could gamble that Alice in Wonderland being a popular work of fiction about a girl lost within a forest could have been a reason for Kate's name quickly becoming known as Alice. That's pure theory though on its origins. Even a dev of the game admitted to calling her Alice, so to make things simpler, I'm going to refer to this monster as Alice from this point forward. It's also only fitting that a monster nicknamed Alice roams a maze with the most secrets and puzzles. There's a pretty big trend with Identity Fraud, and that's deciphering code and jumbled phrases. It honestly serves to strengthen the game even more. Identity Fraud starts with the protagonist being very clearly paranoid and nervous of everything in their surroundings. So it's only fitting that the protagonist would view phrases and search for double meanings that lurk below the surfaces of numbers or just random jumbled phrases, such as how they look under the masks of people and see much more sinister things. Within the second maze is the netgear room. You'll need to use Rot 13 in order to break in. Rot 13 being short for rotate 13, and by shifting 13 places using the Latin alphabet, you can both encrypt and decrypt code. Finally, within the netgear room, stone columns line the sides, a netgear logo floating in the beam of blinding light. Honestly, when I first started writing this video, I kept seeing netgear pop up, and smoking my crack pipe, I immediately started to theorize, coming up with large, grand theories of how netgear interweaves with this plot, and it's just an inside joke between the devs. Apparently a streamer friend was arguing with their parents, and in response their parents snipped their Ethernet cord. Continuing to stream off a netgear dongle, well, you know, that's that theory put to bed. Another top secret hidden room within Maze 2 was the disco party room, locked behind another code that you'll need to use base 64 in order to decipher. Originally, base 64 is primarily used by coders to encode text for special characters, so when sending these binary formats they don't get garbled on the other line. Funnily enough, being used here as a type of lock despite its origins in sending complex information. Inside is a small disco room playing Frenzu's Denim, which is a simple disco-ish song quite reminiscent of Daft Punk. Regardless, you can use this secret room or the actual intended route to enter into the third maze. It's strikingly apparent that the quality of this third maze is of a much higher caliber, and is also guarded by a much more well-dressed monster, James. James, the Scare Master, is the last of the smaller monsters. James roams around the third maze at all times, humming and whirring with his 20 different eyes rotating. It's a simple gimmick of if the monster sees you move, it'll attack you. This time though, if you suddenly stop moving after having been spotted already, James really doesn't care, swapping from his neon red angry eyes back to his coal black set, as he goes back to humping whoever is unfortunate enough to be lost in the maze. Speaking of the maze, it's much more refined as mentioned earlier with the lockers, doors, and proper light bulbs hanging from the ceiling. As you continue walking, you might also notice I don't think I need to explain Morse code, aside from the fact it's a series of beeps that translate into letters and numbers typically used over the radio. The beeping isn't the only thing that's especially strange about the third maze. After properly solving the Morse code, the steel door in front of you slowly opens to reveal a properly lit room. It's even somewhat reminiscent of the Netgear room from earlier. This long hall personally reminds me of the last corridor from Undertale, as it sets up the last encounter. It wouldn't be a proper ending without another code that you're required to crack. This time it's a combination of two different sets of information, one long string of numbers, and a series of seemingly random letters and numbers. Now, as an intellectual, I immediately understood the bottom set as hexadecimals.
Go ahead.
Hexadecimals are interesting because they work on base 16, basically using these 16 characters to create a system most typically seen in computing. Anyways, translating these hexadecimals, they create a sentence that's different for each server that you're in. The phrase is, replace every blank with blank. Well, weird, right? Those blanks are typically filled in with numbers though, and you would need to follow the instructions of the decoded phrase in order to obtain the true passcode using the big string of numbers above. For example, replace every 7 with 1. If the long string is 783117, you would simply replace every 7 with a 1, turning the code into 183111. Finally, with this long code, you can speak it and open the large door into a pitch black room. The last hurdle is, well, the last hurdle. Arguably the strongest monster and the final boss, completely lacking a proper name and so simply being given the title that appears when you enter his room. Digging deeper into the game, I tried to find some special meaning or trait about this boss that might add to its design, except that its design uses the exact same armor as Ralph, a dev even joking that the last hurdle is Ralph's dad. The fight can be split into two phases, which can I say is a major step up from most Roblox boss fights. The first phase consists of sitting behind pillars, taking desperate rocket shots at the boss while he fires his laser pointer into your eyes. Whittling the boss down, you can eventually break him down into a second phase. The room floods with lava pouring down from the walls. Your only option is to move into the center where the boss now hurls bombs straight for you, dodging around the last hurdle until his last bomb is thrown and you can take a sigh of relief. The game slowly fades to black, the devs being listed, and the text, "It was nice while it still lasted." So, what's the point of this video? The game seems pretty straightforward, right? Roblox people hunt you down in a maze, you solve cryptic puzzles to fight a boss, and get kicked from the game. Big whoop. Or at least that's what I'm imagining you guys are saying right now while watching this overly serious Roblox essay video. Well, despite talking about it for a good chunk of the video, this video isn't about identity fraud by itself. It's about identity fraud 2, and the unfinished amazing story it tells. Playing through the original, it's very easy to write the story off, but Identity Fraud 2 gives the game a level of storytelling that you don't often see in Roblox horror. Now, first things first, Identity Fraud 2 is a completely unfinished and abandoned game. Due to this, I don't want to give anyone the wrong idea. Identity Fraud 2 is an objectively bad game. Since the progress on Identity Fraud 2 has been halted, the game has deteriorated over time. To those that are watching and don't understand Roblox game making, I'll give a quick explanation. Roblox is more of a game engine than it is anything else. It gives users the tools to make whatever they want. So, the pros, it's an ever-changing game engine that allows anyone to create on it. The con of that, it's an ever-changing game engine. The Roblox engine is constantly being worked on and updated, whether it's adding additional features or simply working out one of the kinks in it. However, due to this, games made on the Roblox platform need to be continuously updated to keep up with its constantly changing system, and if they're not, they're a ticking time bomb before the game is left in a completely unplayable state. I say this because a lot of the in-game music sounds, and ambiance just simply doesn't exist anymore. Rain doesn't make a sound when hitting the asphalt, and in many of the locations, the ambiance that made the place feel active is removed. I can go on about why this is bad, but what I should point out is because of this, the storytelling and the narrative, by extension, shines even brighter. Previously, this game had two legs to stand on: in-game audio cues and ambiance, as well as a good narrative. Being forced to stand on just one leg, in my eyes at least, has only served to strengthen that leg to make Identity Fraud 2 the successor in storytelling. The intro for Identity Fraud 1 and 2 are almost entirely different in terms of tone. In the first Identity Fraud, you're dejected and silent. Your doctor attempts to dig deeper into your psyche, but you're practically unresponsive because of how paranoid and uncomfortable you become with your surroundings. Identity Fraud 2 is surprisingly on the positive side. You're still cynical about how you don't want to be here in the doctor's office or how you hate talking to therapists. However, you look on the brighter side of things, and you're even responsive when talking to the nurse who takes your vitals. It's a big difference from the first game, and it serves well to create a new aura around your character. This could be because of the ending of the first game and you finding some kind of peace, but I believe there's another reason that I'll get into later. The first maze is a very typical doctor's office, and even though it's extremely minimal, it looks more grounded than the long office halls of the first game. Stan is present in this maze, but overall there's not really much of a threat here. Exiting from the hospital, there's a series of police cars and vehicles blocking your exit, even one of these cars sporting the word Netgear on it, which is part of the reason this shit was so fucking confusing to me. Regardless, to get past the police cars, you'll need to get through this hedge maze, which is extremely reminiscent of another maze I've already talked about. This time, the new monster is Stoic. Stoic is an extremely interesting monster. It's an appearance close to Stan. Stoic doesn't actually kill the player, but rather abducts them. This is where things take a bit of a turn. The wiki depicts of a torture chamber where Stoic will kill you unless solving a base 64 puzzle. However, in recent days, I can no longer find this. Rather, Stoic now simply sends you into what appears to just be a normal basement. The basement is still a part of the main map, and leaving from it, you're surrounded by the city. The map is still maze-like and confusing, but as opposed to the first game, you can still tell some people used to live here. The mazes continue and even lead into what appears to be a cavern, but there's no monsters here. Honestly, trying to write for this segment was really difficult because how do you write about nothing? There's walking for sure and some interesting details, but that's mostly it until you reach your apartment. It's never explained why you're being evicted or even what just happened with the hospital. Instead, the game simply fades to black. It's the end of Chapter 1.
Hi, this is Travis from the front desk at Grace Mercy West Hospital. I'm calling you to verify your appointment you have scheduled at 9 o'clock. Yes, you have an appointment. I guess someone must not have told you, or you may have forgotten. However, just to make sure I know who I'm talking to, I'll subject you to an identification check. So, what's your patient ID? Alright. What's your middle name? Okay. Lastly, what's your CSC? Alright, thank you. Have a nice day.
The hospital has requested your presence for another appointment. It's another long walking segment with the world around you somehow even getting more bizarre. People speaking through intercoms using the military alphabet to help you open locked doors, for example. And in this next segment, you meet the patient. The only issue, I've never even seen this antagonist. It's a faceless man in a gown that slowly roams through the second maze in Chapter 2. The method of killing isn't really known either, as he simply makes contact with you and kills you immediately. It's a long and empty walk up until you get to the hospital. Upon checking into the hospital, you're immediately recognized because of how often you visit. The receptionist of the hospital checks for your 9 o'clock appointment, but is pulling nothing that even references such an appointment even existing. Inquiring further about your appointment, you can bring up the fact that you spoke on the phone earlier to a man named Travis who works at the hospital. The only issue, there's nobody named Travis who works at the hospital. You were easily manipulated into giving up sensitive information over the phone, and now you must walk back home knowing that your identity has the potential of being stolen. Travis is not who you thought he was, stealing valuable information from you without you even knowing. The walk home is the most bizarre maze in all of identity fraud. I mentioned earlier that despite the city being maze-like, you could at least get some kind of feel for it. There was something there that almost grounded you. The city now has become much more confusing, and the maze is now extremely massive and empty. It's reminiscent of one of the mazes from the first identity fraud because of how deserted and contorted it feels. It doesn't help that the city is now a sprawling space. It took me a good solid 30 or so minutes to simply get out. However, there seems to be only one exit from this prison. It's an axe. This segment is jarring. You're suddenly given a means of defense as these monsters of pure light rush you. Simply out of instinct, when given a weapon like this, you swing back quickly, slowly moving through the alleys as you swipe away at the figures until finally reaching one simply just standing there. In your paranoid frenzy, you murdered an innocent man that simply stood there on the street. It's never shown your arrest or trial, but it's quite evident that it didn't go well, seeing as you're immediately taken on a prison bus. Chapter 3 has the biggest change in gameplay. No longer crawling through sprawling mazes, being hunted by monsters lurking around the corners, rather having to deal with an even greater horror, social interaction. The prison bus you're sitting on is taking you, as well as a bunch of other convicts, to a holding prison before sorting you into your proper facilities. It's something that doesn't really make too much sense considering the fact you just brutalized someone on the pavement and now you'll be hanging out with a bunch of other people like bank robbers. Even an NPC brings us up and pokes fun at it for how weird it is. Speaking of bank robbers, this is where you get to meet Gus and Greg, two bank robbers who've met a similar fate and gotten arrested. Gus being the more cynical and cold one, whilst Greg is much more nervous and sociable, even trying to spark a conversation with you as you sit alone on the bus. Speaking with Gus and Greg, you hear a familiar name. Travis. Gus and Greg were arrested out of nowhere. All their ends were tied up except for someone who could have outed them. Travis. They explain that Travis loved using proxies and whatnot. Upon hearing this, you can admit to them that Travis indirectly caused you to end up here, but before being able to elaborate, you get to prison. The constant smoky and rainy look at the prison reminds me of Silent Hill. Kind of off topic, but the reason the fog exists in Silent Hill was primarily to make it so that the game could unrender things that weren't in the fog's radius, so the game could conserve polygons and not lag or crash. It had the unintended effect of making the game more claustrophobic and eerie, and Identity Fraud does as well, making the prison feel even more claustrophobic as if the steel bars didn't already do that. Most of the inmates don't really care about you, and even the guards seem indifferent about your existence, though through processing you meet one of the few friendly faces. Andre. Andre is simply a source of conversation to the protagonist, helping you get accustomed to your surroundings and the rules of prison. It's honestly jarring. For long stretches of the game so far, you've been alone whilst out in the open. However, the moment you get locked up in a prison and the closed off, you find the most friendly faces. Past Andre is the Chow Hall, where you can meet up with Gus and Greg again. They're not all that interested in Travis, having bigger fish to fry, like how to get out of this place, tossing around ideas but not really settling on anything quite yet. Later that night, you can find Andre again as he tells you one of the more interesting stories. Andre tells you about an inmate who came in through processing, talking big game and speaking about how many friends he had on the outside and how dangerous he could be. However, once the inmates checked him on his lies and realized he had nobody, they gave him the beatdown of a lifetime, leaving him hospitalized but shattering his ego more than his limbs ever could have been. It brings up the reoccurring theme of people wearing masks. This entire time we've been playing as someone weary of everyone due to a fear of who they are, being told stories of someone who feared nothing and was beaten down until sinking to our level of confidence. The game follows a more episodic approach, where you're swapping from jail life to these surreal dreams that don't really make any sense, falling asleep and waking up again in your therapist's office, with this most likely being the therapist that the protagonist mentioned at the very beginning of Identity Fraud 2, having been nice but withholding much of the information due to a lack of trust. This dream is no different from the earlier description descriptions, the receptionist lets you into your therapist's office where they simply try to understand you better, recommending that you should socialize more, which, funnily enough, you don't really have much of a choice anymore considering where you are when you're awake, back in prison. The day is more of the same, Andre telling you to be safe, Gus and Greg talking about breaking out and what life will be like on the outside. This time you can talk to Andre a little bit more about why you're here, about the murder and how confused you were, about how confused and afraid that man must have been. Andre not really having anything to say as you confess to him your emotions about the murder. With nothing else to say, it's another day down and another dream sequence. However, it's not your therapist. It's with something more sinister. Let's rewind for a bit. Remember when I was talking about the monsters from the first game? Well, there's one other monster I intentionally withheld till this point. Ralph was special because of how he changed the game's ambiance with his spawning. He isn't the only one with that power though. And I also spoke about how Identity Fraud was an interesting name because of another monster's name, Fraud. Now, we can talk about the most confusing part of this puzzle, Identity. Identity in the first game is an extremely rare spawning monster. So rare, in fact, that the only video I could find of him was of these, what I'm assuming to be Russian players finding him. Identity slowly walks towards you, but rather than killing you, he takes you to a prison cell. The video shows the player walking around some and seeing other inmates horrified, but the wiki speaks about how you would normally be gunned down in your cell by the authorities. Back to where we are now, it's a subway car. Identity simply sits down, nonchalantly waiting for you. It's impossible to deny the fact he's very similar to the G-Man from the Half-Life series. Identity isn't given a proper name here, simply being denoted by question marks. Identity seems to taunt you for how confused you are and how you prioritize knowledge over being guilt-ridden by your murder, abruptly ending the dream before ever giving you an answer to any question you might have had for them. The next day is more of the same, except for the person hanging from the ceiling. It's not all too uncommon for comedic relief to be seen in games with depressing themes, but for Identity Fraud to have comedic relief, it's a rare occasion. It mostly feels like the dev behind this knew that the plot was slowly becoming more dark, so they just threw in something to try and lighten the mood. After talking to that guy, Gus and Greg are still formulating plans and ideas. They've slowly gotten to the point where they have a rough idea, but the finer details just haven't been worked out yet. They talk more about their own lives and the families they have back at home. I doubt it's intentional, but I do find it interesting that even when befriending people, you're still alienated. Not intentionally, but this entire game you've had no one except for yourself. So the moment you find people that are of a similar situation as you still can't relate to them fully because of the differences in backgrounds. That night you have another dream about your therapist. Speaking with the receptionist before your session, he gets a call on the office phone from a familiar person.
Hello, no one is available to take your call. Please leave a message after the tone.
Good job. You got yourself locked up. Makes my job a whole lot easier.
Travis. The office where your therapist works is becoming increasingly more damaged and decrepit, the change even being visible on Jay's face. Jay, your therapist, becomes increasingly more and more annoyed at the lack of engagement during your sessions. It's becoming increasingly apparent that these dreams are pulling from reality, with how at the beginning of Identity Fraud 2, a lot of the things mentioned in the intro dialogue seem to be repeating themselves here. Your therapist chastises you for how he wishes to help, but you refuse to let him in. With that, you wake up in your bed again. Gus and Greg have finally worked out their escape plans. Only issue is that they've both worked out their own plan, so they'll have to decide which one works the best. As your escape nears closer and closer, it almost seems as if the dialogue shared between Gus and Greg shorten more and more, with Andre taking a bit of your time today, asking if you would let him tag along in the escape plan. Regardless of what you say to Andre, the night is still the same. It's another meeting with Identity. Identity gives you a bit of an idea where you are. It's a subway car, floating out in space and time, heading from nowhere to a destination of nowhere. It speaks on human nature and how confused you still appear to be. Identity takes a page out of your therapist's book and tells you to interact and speak to the others. Whether it's because Identity has strings attached to people or he simply wants you to free yourself, we never know about its motives. The next day is the shortest. You don't even get to speak to Gus and Greg. Ironic considering your dreams are telling you to talk to everyone. The only interesting part about today is one of the inmates threatening you about your escape plan, saying if you don't take him along that he has friends on the outside. It's a similar situation to something you've already heard before from Andre. Your choice doesn't exactly matter as the night ends with another therapy session in your dreams. The therapist office is now dismantled and falling apart. The receptionist is friendly, but Your dialogue to them is slurred and unintelligible. In your delusional state, you stumble back to your therapist, but before reaching their room, it's too late. Your screen goes white, and Chapter 3 ends. Chapter 4? Just kidding. That's actually where Identity Fraud ends. No, I'm not kidding. Identity Fraud leaves you on this massive cliffhanger. You're never gonna find out if Gus and Greg escape alive. You're never gonna find out who Identity is and what they even want. You're never gonna find out whether that inmate has people on the outside that are waiting there to hurt you and your friends. You're never gonna find out if Andre successfully helps you escape and he escapes as well. And you're never gonna find out who Travis even is. There was a teaser released. It has a psychologist who looks identical to Identity showing you ink plots, asking you about how you feel. The session is short-lived before Gus and Greg visit you to ask you what escape plan you want to commit on, but that's it for Identity Fraud. It is one of, if not the most dissatisfying and disappointing endings to a game that is actually written somewhat well. However, that's not where I'm going to close this on. This is the part of the video where, I smoke my natural herbs and I talk seriously about the plot of a Roblox game. The protagonist is desperately struggling with mental health issues. Whether it's genetic or due to traumatic complications, we simply do not know. You've been dealt multiple therapists, multiple doctors, and multiple nurses, but the paranoia of simply existing was simply too great. There's two games, obviously, Identity Fraud and Identity Fraud 2. It's easy to look at these two games and view the plot in chronological order, but I see Identity Fraud 2 as the prequel to the very first Identity Fraud. This is purely theory and speculation though. Let's take a moment and look at how both games start and how they play out. Identity Fraud begins depressing. You're subjected to a doctor's visit that you probably didn't even want to show up to in the first place. You're quiet and paranoid and even believe that the doctor has poisoned you. This is a far cry from the beginnings of the second game. You seem to have your wit about you. You're still nervous, but you're much more calm and collected, being able to speak back in full sentences and respond to questions easily. I view these games as the regression of a mentally ill individual suffering from schizophrenia. The down spiral of someone who never opened up, shut themselves off from everyone who tried to help, and suffered the consequences that came with severe paranoia. I get that jumping immediately to schizophrenia is a massive leap in logic. Just because someone who visits the therapist has mental health issues does not mean they're schizophrenic. However, a lot of the small hints and behaviors support this. The constant bouts and paranoia, the reclusivity to people, and the disorganized speech patterns seen at the end of the second game. Let's look at James's background art for a second and brighten it up. There's a code covering the wall behind him. Well, decoding the wall behind him gives us a singular word: schizophrenia. Everything seems intentional. Stan is the manifestation of your fear of being watched, and it's a fear that's haunted you since the beginning. Fraud could be an exaggerated persona of Travis. Whilst Travis from the first game simply stole your identity, Fraud is here to steal your body. Ralph could be an exaggerated form of Stoic as well. Stoic simply sprinted about with a bat and large red eyes. Ralph being placed down with a much more sinister set of beady white eyes and a large machete that he drags around. The second game ends as you desperately try to reach your therapist's office, and the first game starts with you speaking to a doctor. The second game begins with you walking around a large open city that has clear examples of life, and the first game has you wandering through these confusing halls of torment. If you're playing as the same person between these two games, it's almost funny how far down you've spiraled. I hate to throw this theory out there because I've seen it 100,000 times in many pieces of media, but what if the first game is a set of nightmares and delusions brought to you by your collapsing psyche? With these nightmares even repeating locations that you've experienced before. The beige brick walls are somewhat reminiscent of the brick walls of the apartments, the hedge maze being a reminder of the hedge maze outside of the hospital, and the locker room being somewhat similar to the doctor's office. Perhaps the biggest piece of this being identity, interacting with identity and forcing you to wake up back in your cell to suffer the consequences of your murder by firing squad. For the monsters, well, for James we can infer it's a continuation of the fear of being watched. However, based upon the similar location and attire, I would say it's a much more acute fear of being watched by professionals. Doctors have been trying to help you from the beginning, jumping at any moment to help you, with this being manifested as James, who will jump at you for simply moving about. Alice being perhaps a fear of going outside or simply of nature. She functions off of being completely camouflaged in the hedge maze. The protagonist likely has a fear of what could be out there in the wilderness awaiting them. This slow regression from speaking and being open to being quiet and cold after having your identity stolen, and then paranoid and delusional at the beginning of the first game, is something that sets up the last hurdle. There's no bosses in Identity Fraud 2 and no secret goofy rooms. It cements my reasoning even more for believing that this first game purely takes place in your mind. Whatever the last hurdle represents is something that's taken hold of you and has rooted itself deep within your own mind. It could symbolize all the horrors and fears you've experienced. It could symbolize the confusing nature of the spaces you've explored whilst experiencing your schizophrenic thoughts. It could even represent both of these things as this uncaring entity that attempts to kill you and remove your existence, killing it and finally setting to rest all of this pain and suffering. We don't know what happens after you snip the root, but it does leave us with this final message. It was fun while it lasted. This fun being an escape from yourself. However you see these games are up to you. At the end of the day, Identity Fraud has had a massive impact upon the Roblox horror community. I remember being 14 and playing Identity Fraud for the first time, and I hate to admit it, but I was genuinely afraid of this game. Playing it with friends and laughing together about how scary it was. It wasn't until later, when I played the second game a few years ago, that I understood what I was playing. You can't really box up Identity Fraud as another game and relate it to other games by saying it's just like this or just like that. It almost seems futile. It's better written than most Roblox games I've played, and there's no way I could express the amount of love and the amount of fear I have for Identity Fraud.
Drew, run! Drew, run!
November.
Are we the maze runners?
Fuck, of course. Dreamer, I mean, I didn't
Max, I
realize
got
the
bad news. An e-girl's humping you. Max, red alert. E-girl humping you. Max, red alert. Red alert.
Not red alert. Red alert. It's green, it's green.
It's me, bro.
Oh shit, it's fraud, it's fraud, it's fraud. Well, that's the video. This is the unscripted portion where I just kind of like awkwardly talk into a mic and say thanks, appreciate it, thank you for watching. Even though I didn't talk to any of them directly, thank you to all the people at the Identity Fraud Wiki. A lot of the screenshots I used in this video was from them giving to me, so that was really good and nice of them. I heavily recommend checking that out. I recommend checking out the Team Motherboard Discord. If you have any other comments, questions, interests, talk in the comments section, whatever. I'll probably resume making Arcane Odyssey videos, or just like videos in general of like talking about stories. This Identity Fraud video has been in the making for quite some time, a couple months now actually, or at least like the introductory recording for it has been in the works for a few months. Thank you personally to all of my friends, Area 54 or whatever. They helped a lot when it came to, you know, playing through these games and whatnot. I'm not gonna lie to you, a lot of the game is just kind of straight up walking, but playing with friends makes it way more enjoyable, way more interesting, and just a whole lot better. This is another reason why the second game is a little lackluster at times, but it's regardless still something I wanted to talk about. The impact of Identity Fraud has been seen widely. I'm willing to bet money a good chunk of modern Roblox horror devs have played Identity Fraud or have pulled things from Identity Fraud. Honestly, my favorite game of like all time on Roblox is Isle. If you haven't played it, I highly recommend you play it. And one of the main monsters, it doesn't actually have a proper name, but its appearance is similar to Stan. So literally the entire Isle player base calls that monster Stan. Like, can you imagine your game being so like big that other monsters in games that don't have names, you immediately start calling them something from Identity Fraud? Like, that's wild to me. But yeah, normal content should be resuming somewhat soon. Probably make some random video on sailing or the alchemy update or whatever else. Unless this video gets 100,000 likes. I'm just kidding. I'm just kind of speaking into the void right now. But thanks for watching. Really appreciate it. If you did sit through the entire thing, even though these videos are difficult to make because they're extremely long and the script writing process is kind of taxing on, well, everything, to be honest. It was still fun to make and to talk about. That's it. See you guys soon or later or whatever. Bye.
When I get fucking flashed, it's like some big brolic black dude named fucking McQueen. I had a bed sheet around my head and proceeded to go fuck me!